As if being homeless wasn't hard enough, there's now a growing trend of local laws across America turning homelessness into a criminal offense. Take, for instance, Bakersfield, California, where an aggressive ban on begging is set to take effect, making panhandling near businesses a misdemeanor. But the Bakersfield law is only one example of how communities are clamping down on homelessness. In the heart of Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, California, local lawmakers have enacted a law that actually bans sleeping in cars. That's right. Sleeping in something that you own could potentially lead you to 6 months in jail or a $1,000 fine under the argument that it damages the city's quality of life. And by city, I mean the 1%. Because depriving the poor of their last option for shelter certainly isn't protecting their quality of life. The end goal of these so-called quality of life laws is to make these cities practically impossible to live in for those who can't afford it. And what's worse is that these types of laws are expanding nationwide. According to a survey of 234 cities by the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, 40% of the cities polled upheld bans on sleeping in public, 33% banned sitting, and upwards of 50% of cities have laws against panhandling. Wow. These stats paint a picture of an all-out legal assault on homelessness. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. In dozens of other towns, ordinances go as far as banning people from even helping the poor. For example, in Birmingham, Alabama, a Christian ministry is being blocked by police for handing out hot dogs and bottled water, citing the need to have a $500 permit to distribute food from a vehicle. The same is true in cities like Dallas, Philadelphia, and even New York City. In New York, a ban on food donations to homeless shelters is being justified because, get this, the city simply cannot assess the salt, fat, and fiber content in the food. Right. So, with corporate profits at a record high and income inequality in America growing faster than any other industrialized country, I have to ask, when did the war on poverty turn into a war against the poor? Joining me now to talk about just that, I'm joined by Eugene Puryear, organizer with the Answer Coalition, author of the book Shackled and Chained. Eugene, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, as always.
Eugene, I wanted to take a quick look at some of these headlines. U.S. poverty rises despite economic recovery. 4 out of 5 Americans face near poverty. That is insane. Why are we seeing this kind of downward trend after 50 years of fighting the so-called war on poverty?
Well, I think what we're seeing is really the results of the fact that, well, in general, capitalism is one of the reality of it is, you know, there's only but so much wealth, and most of it goes to really rich people. But more immediately, we've seen that even the smaller steps taken, starting with the Johnson administration and the war on poverty, a 35-year assault on every social program, on unions, on pensions, wages that don't keep up with productivity. So essentially, even the smallest measures, just about every measure that helps mitigate poverty has been taken away, while many, many measures that help enhance the wealth of the 1% of the few have been continually boosted forward by the government. So we've seen a greater immiseration of people.
I'm glad you mentioned benefits because I wanted to take a look at this 2013 census supplemental poverty measure. Almost 50 million people in the U.S. are poor. Food stamps keeps 5 million people out of poverty. This is the most shocking. Without Social Security, more than half of Americans over 65 and over rather, would be in poverty. How much specifically is the assault on social services increasing this gap?
Oh, in a major way. I mean, we see that food stamps in just every budgetary cycle for the past 2 or 3 years has been one of the #1 targets of Republicans, and that Democrats have connived in order to make these bargains and these deals to, you know, keep the budget going and all of that. They've caved on their principles, and they're continually agreeing to smaller than what's originally proposed reductions, but not being able to really step forward and fight for these programs. We see that they also, President Obama coming out for, or originally now, since it's an election year, he's changed his tactics so people will vote for the Democrats, but coming out for chained CPI and Social Security, which will ultimately lower people's benefits. So both parties are colluding around an agenda, which means reduce social services, and these social services are really a lifeline for people who aren't seeing any help from their wages and from their pensions, which are depressed.
They really are a lifeline, and what's amazing is that you don't really hear the GOP or Democratic Party, for instance, ever talking about the enormous amount of aid, hundreds of millions of dollars in aid given to dozens of countries around the world when we could, I mean, it's just a non-issue. The Social Security is a non-issue. I can't stress that enough. What do you think about all the measures that are being taken, as I just outlined, criminalizing the poor? I mean, not just neglecting them, straight up criminalizing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's truly unbelievable in so many different ways, because every politician says they care about the poor. They say they care about the homeless. This is like the #1 thing. But we see over and over again, whether it's food distribution, anything of that nature is being criminalized and being further put into channels that make it harder and harder for people to engage in mutual aid type solidarity, for people who, and this is sort of one of the quietest kept secrets of America, it's people who have more modest means who give the most money to charity. And so this is just a way to stop people and to more directly control how people interact with each other. And that's something we're seeing on just about every level in this society, a greater curtailment, a panopticon from the NSA and others, and all sorts of things that make it much harder for us to interact as human beings and much easier for the corporate, big business controlled government to define what our lives are and what our values and the ideological frame of our society will be.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it just is really disturbing to have the middle class and even upper class say, we just don't want to see it. People in Silicon Valley, whatnot, not too many middle class in Silicon Valley, of course, but clearly there's something deeply wrong here. As I mentioned, corporate profits record high, income inequality growing faster than every other industrialized country. Disturbing. How can we address this beyond just superficial adjustments here? Because we're not seeing anything be done. In fact, it's getting worse.
Well, I think we have to do a number of things. One, we have to really look at true living wages. $15 an hour, that's just one place to start. We live here in Washington, D.C. If you're a single mother, a living wage is $27 an hour.
Wow.
If the minimum wage had kept up to where it was in the mid-'60s, it'd be something like $28 an hour. So we see how far we are behind in terms of wages. We also need to allow workers the right to organize. We need to bring back pensions and not have people have to gamble their money in the stock market to have a real retirement. And ultimately, we need to move beyond our current system, this capitalist system that really favors profit over people, and we need to move to an area where, there's so much rural poverty. This is where they go with the Keystone XL pipeline and things like that, and they say, here's all this money because you live in poverty. We need a system that over and above all needs prioritizes people and the planet over and above profit and, corporate billionaires buying Aspen ski lodges.
I agree that capitalism in its current form is definitely failing, Eugene, but I think it's just so much for people to really accept that let's abandon this system, embrace a new one, completely restructure society. Is there anything that we can do within the framework that exists, as you just mentioned? I mean, pushing for pensions, unions, stuff like that. I know that you're running for city council here in D.C. Talk about kind of the small local measures that people can take here in the city outward to address this and help uplift the poor. We have about a minute left.
Definitely. I think people need to push for higher wages. That's, one of the #1 issues is that our wages, they haven't kept up with productivity. They haven't kept up with the cost of living. So there's people who are going to work every single day who live in homeless shelters. And when we look at that reality, I think that's one of the biggest #1 issues is that we have to bring wages back in line with reality of what it costs to live. And that's why I'm pushing for a $15 minimum wage here in Washington, D.C. We're seeing it catching fire all across the country with fast food and low-wage worker strikes. Shama Sawan in Seattle, who I know you've also had on your show. So this is, I think, one of the first key steps that we must take is to really find a way to make the minimum wage a living wage and to give workers on their job the ability to organize, to find ways to just close these gaps, bring back pensions, and certainly also close some of the deeper inequalities like the gender gap.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Eugene Pure.
Thank you
really
so much
appreciate you coming on.